I'm Sarah Mueller, a reporter with Forbes. Now, we have a lot to break down because last night was our first RNC debate. I'm here with Professor Tim Hagle from the University of Iowa to talk everything that happened. First of all, I just want to know who do you think came out on top? What do you think was the big takeaway from last night?
The first part of that question, in terms of who came out on top, is always a very, very subjective examination or evaluation. If you like a particular candidate, you probably think he or she did well. If you don't like them, you usually kind of discount it to a certain extent. So it's hard to get any kind of objective measurement. Nevertheless, it did seem that certain people did better than others. And usually that's how it works. It's very rare that you can actually just flat out win a debate like this because they're often just not debating. It's a more matter of, did anybody make a big mistake, or did anybody just do well or do above expectations? And in that regard, you had a few people that did fairly well. DeSantis did well, kind of expectation that some of the other candidates would have gone after him, and they really didn't. So he was out of the fray for the most part, was able to make a number of his fairly strong points, talking about his record in Florida and so forth. Nikki Haley also came on fairly strong and was very energetic and engaged with some of the other people, particularly Ramaswamy. And so she, I think, did well for herself too. Christie, of course, is his basic objective, I guess, in the campaign is to go after Trump. That's what he does. That's what he is accused of in last night's debate as well. And he did that, and he did it very well. And that's one of his strengths, is this kind of a thing. And he basically engaged with Ramaswamy as well. And so even though people aren't probably going to support him for the nomination, at least not here in Iowa, I think he's doing better in New Hampshire, maybe some other places as well, but he probably won't get the nomination. But he still came across fairly well in terms of making the points he wanted to make. Other people perhaps didn't do as well. One of the kind of surprises was Tim Scott, not because he did anything really bad, he just didn't do a whole lot. That he didn't seem to be engaged. He made some good points, as is usually the case, talking about faith and family and opportunity and things of that nature, but he just didn't seem to engage and didn't have as much time as you might have expected. So he didn't hurt himself, but he really didn't help himself. And that was a bit of a surprise. Doug Burgum did okay. He didn't get a lot of time, not surprising given that he was low in the polls, and the folks on the outside of the lineup there tend to not get as much time. But he also got credit for having injured himself, torn his Achilles tendon beforehand, being in the emergency room, and still managed to stand up there for 2 hours. And he seemed a little uncomfortable at times, but you have to give him credit for being there and all, I guess, under those circumstances. Couple of people who didn't do well but really weren't expected to. Asa Hutchinson just didn't come across well. And at one point, he talked about January 6th as an insurrection, which is, from Republicans' point of view, is basically a Democrat's talking point. And he also is one that goes after Trump, but he's just not as good at it as Christie. And basically, I wouldn't even expect Hutchinson to make the second debate. We'll have to see if he does resonate to a certain extent. And so, in that regard, he's probably out of it at this point. Well, one of the people that seemed to get a lot of attention, and according to some polls or something this morning, Vivek Ramaswamy got a lot of attention and seemed to please a lot of people. Very talkative on stage, engaged with a lot of people. The problem is that he got called on his stuff. That basically, in terms of the candidates that were attacking others on the stage, they mostly were going after Ramaswamy. Now, he kind of expected that before the debate occurred. There was some suggestion that because he seemed to have some momentum, was rising a bit in the polls, which is why he was located right next to DeSantis as sort of the second spot, that people would come after him. And they did. But he also brought it on himself to a certain extent, that he came across as one report indicated, kind of smart alecky. And I think he had talked about at some point how he had been bullied in school. And I actually got the impression that he's kind of that smart aleck kid that's really smart, knows a lot, but sort of haunts some of the other people, like the jocks who then throw him in a locker. So he's kind of came across as that a little bit. And another sort of phrase that I was thinking of is, in Texas, they'll sometimes say, is a person that's all hat, no cattle, that he seemed kind of superficial. And in fact, at one point, he talked about how he didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience. And Haley even called him on that basically suggesting that Ramaswamy was saying things that he really didn't understand, changing his position, things of that nature. But, some people like that. And so it maybe came across as being the favorite or the person who won, put that in quotation marks, the debate in terms of a lot of people. So that's kind of the short breakdown of how things seemed to go last night for the most part, at least in my view.
Quickly, I want to touch on Pence because that was kind of shocking to me to see how aggressive he was in responding, especially between him and Vivek. There was this discourse happening, and Ron DeSantis is in the middle, kind of getting the crossfire. But I mean, I didn't expect them to be going at it. What did you think?
Pence was interesting in terms of what he did. He was another one who probably helped himself a little bit. Again, he came across as being a serious statesman. And again, even if you don't agree with what he did on January 6th in terms of, in his view, upholding the Constitution and doing his duty and adhering to his oath, not just to the Constitution, but as he phrased it, to God as well, that it was a serious person. But one of the concerns that Republicans, aside from, if you're a Trump supporter, you're probably not happy with Pence anyway in terms of what he did. But in terms of Republican voters in general, the concern with Pence is that maybe he wasn't enough of a fighter, that either because of January 6th or just in general, he came across as maybe a little too mild for what Republican voters want these days. And even to the extent that Republican voters, some at least, don't like Trump's style, they like the fact that he was willing to fight back, particularly against the media that they didn't like, if it was the fake news side of things, or other politicians or the deep state, whatever you want to call it, that at least Trump was fighting, again, even if they didn't necessarily like his style. And so we're sort of at a position right now where the Republicans will still want somebody who's going to be a fighter, maybe not with quite the abrasive style that Trump had. And so that was kind of Pence's problem. But in the debate last night, he seemed fairly strong. And there were a couple of times where he did show a little bit of humor, a little bit of willingness to go after other people. And of course, Ramaswamy was the object of a couple of those things, where Ramaswamy kept referring to everybody else on the stage as a professional politician and a PAC, Political Action Committee puppet. And at one point, when Pence and Ramaswamy got into it, a little bit of a back and forth, Pence showed a little bit more of a willingness to fight. So again, I think that probably Pence helped himself. I still don't think that he's going to have a really serious shot at the nomination, but he still came off better than I think a lot of people would have expected.
Well, and to your point, we had a question even around whether Pence upheld, the Constitution that day. Did he do the right thing that day? And they made them go down the line and say yes or no. And one person who kind of got hung up was DeSantis. Like, he was so concentrated on saying, we're not going to focus on the past. I don't want to focus on the past. They had to ask him, I think, about 3 times, can you answer the question? Do you think he did the right thing that day? And finally he said, yeah, I think he did his duty. Like, I don't have any beef with him. That was kind of an odd response in my mind. What did you think of it?
Yeah, the response by DeSantis, I can sort of understand it. And part of the reason I think DeSantis really wasn't sort of overly enthusiastic about saying, oh, yes, Pence did a great job, hero for the country, as some of the other people did, were a little more effusive about how Trump handled himself. I think part of that is that DeSantis has answered that question a couple of times. That I think it came up. I'm not sure which events, but in the leadership summit and the RBI's Lincoln dinner, and some of the other areas where he gets questions. People that are Trump supporters, will maybe ask him about that one way or the other, or people who aren't Trump supporters will ask him about that. And again, some of these candidates are saying, look, we're dwelling too much on the past, which of course is one of the criticisms of Trump, is because he often talks about how the 2020 election, in his view, was stolen. And, it's kind of a retribution, and this is why I should be the nominee again. And DeSantis, who of course also wants to be the nominee, says, let's move on. Let's move past that. We've got to look to the future, not to the past. And so I think he's just frustrated with that particular question, or at least seemingly so. And so the fact that he basically said, yeah, I think Trump has did the right thing, did a good job. Didn't want to just emphasize that. And then other people, as a way to maybe attack DeSantis, say, well, hey, you weren't sufficiently enthusiastic in your answer there. and better try again. And that's why they had to come back to that a couple of times when some of the other candidates even questioned DeSantis on that. So it's one of the times when DeSantis came under a little bit of fire for some of his responses.
Now, I want to quickly get into the fact that DeSantis was not attacked much last night. And one of the theories that I heard was that because he is kind of a front runner of those on the stage, obviously not including Trump, that they didn't want to give him more airtime. So they wouldn't attack him to give him more time to respond. What do you think the tactic was there?
That's hard to say. And I suppose the theory that they didn't want to attack DeSantis to give him more airtime, there may be something to that. But on the other hand, if the person's the front runner, and if you think the person has weaknesses, that's the person you need to go after. And they didn't do it. And that was kind of surprising. And so it was a little bit surprising that they decided to do more in terms of attacks to go after Ramaswamy. Now, again, I think Ramaswamy probably had more vulnerabilities because leading up to the debate, one of the things that the news was talking about was how he had, in fact, changed his position on a couple of things. There was some issue over what's called 9/11 trutherism and whether the government was telling us everything they knew about this. And he had denied in a CNN interview that he had said a particular thing in another interview with the reporter for The Atlantic. And he said, no, I never said that. And then The Atlantic released the audio tapes where he did say exactly what he was being asked about. So, basically it gave a lot of people that opportunity to really kind of go after Ramaswamy. So if they're thinking that at some point, maybe, well, DeSantis is because of Trump attacking him so much and the media going after DeSantis to a certain extent as well, that he's going to fall by the wayside. So I need to be ready to step into that second place. And so it's rather be me than Ramaswamy. So, it's like a bank shot kind of a thing where you don't go after the one that's obvious because you think that person's going to go out. So you go after the next one you think is going to step up because that's the person you're competing with at this particular point. And to some extent that makes sense because you've got Trump, of course, who's by far, at least in the polls, the front runner, and DeSantis is usually well above everybody else in the field. So the rest of the folks there, with occasional instances where a few of the people break double digits here and there, Ramaswamy and Scott in particular in Iowa, everybody else is in single digits. And so they're sort of fighting for the scraps at this point.
Now, there was a lot of response from the audience last night, including during the intros, Christie and Asa Hutchinson were booed by the crowd. There was also a lot of kind of one-liners last night. Some that I think stood out for me was when Pence referred to Vivek and said, this is not the time for on-the-job training, or DeSantis saying he was going to sit Fauci down and say, you're fired, or Christie saying that Vivek sounded like ChatGPT. And even one of the more shocking ones was when Vivek was going after some of the other people on stage for their reaction to the Ukraine war and calling Zelensky their Pope. And so what do you think these one-liners end up having to do with the audience reaction? Do you think those even resonate? Do you think they're like just catchy phrases so that, they can make some headlines? How do you think that gets through to voters?
Well, I think it gets through the voters just from the fact that we're talking about it right now. That it's nice, of course, if it's a line that lands during the debate, which is to say that you get a reaction from the crowd, particularly if it's applause. If it's boos, not so much. That's not what you're necessarily looking for. Although when Christie at one point was making a point and the crowd started booing him, he said, look, boos are allowed. This is America. You can disagree with me, but here are the facts. And so again, and Christie, again, even if you don't agree with him, he did fairly well in terms of making the points he wanted to make. But as far as the one-liners are concerned, it's the kind of a thing that, sometimes these things are scripted for the candidates. Sometimes the candidates are sufficiently quick-witted that they can come up with these or have thought about them in the past. Because at least by the time we get to the debate, they've had to answer some of these questions, even if not face-to-face with the candidates. Sometimes the candidates have had events where they appear sort of one after the other rather than all on the stage at the same time. And so they know what the other candidates are going to say. And so at some point, they start to prepare responses. And that's not unusual. That's kind of expected. And in fact, even in, like high school debate, that you get used to that because you kind of run across the same competitors all the time. And so at some point, you know what they're going to say. So you prepare a response for the next time you may meet them in the next tournament or whatever it happens to be. And so it's the same idea here. And so some of these things are scripted, and you hope that they're a line that lands, because if the line does land, if it gets a positive reaction, then you get the media talking about it. Oh, that was clever, or that one really cut, or that was a particular hurt. And so again, that's the thing with Ramaswamy, is that some of those lines about on-the-job training, or I had to laugh when I heard the Chat GPT one, where he's basically Ramaswamy's firing off all these statements that don't seem to have as much thought behind them, at least as some of the other candidates would have preferred. And so as a result, there's lines that we talk about, and they can sometimes hurt if they really have that element of truth to them, or they can sometimes deflate a criticism. If it's, again, thinking back to the Reagan-Mondale debate from years and years ago, where Reagan was criticized leading up to the debate, Reagan was criticized for his old age at the time, which of course is younger than the candidates we've got these days with Biden and Trump, but still at the time Reagan was considered old, and was sort of expecting this kind of criticism, and he turned that around and saying that he wasn't going to discriminate against Mondale because Mondale's youth and inexperience, and even Mondale laughed at that line. So it sort of deflated an attack against Trump. So you have to be ready as a candidate for some of these attacks, either that you're going to make or that are going to be made against you. And if you've got sort of that sharp one-liner in response, it can be very helpful to you.
Now let's talk about Vivek for a moment. I think that watching him last night, I have seen a lot of this charisma as I followed them on the campaign trail very much translate to on stage. He's very good at working a crowd. I don't think anybody can deny that. But they called out a lot of his flaws, being the only person that doesn't have a political track record, especially not being elected into office before. I mean, what do you see as the outcome from his performance? Do you think this is going to really start pulling him ahead?
In fact, I think the opposite. That I think that Vivek, that's how it's pronounced apparently, that Vivek rhymes with cake is how I
Yes, I was told that on the campaign trail too. Vivek like cake.
Vivek like cake. So in his case, he did have that momentum going, and he get that charisma that you mentioned with something other people had talked about, and people said yes, he's very personable, he's very charming kind of a person, which you kind of expect. A successful business person is often that way, although sometimes you can have examples of people that are otherwise. But that's sort of his style, and it came across very well and got him a lot of attention. But the problem is he doesn't have perhaps enough experience to back it up. Now, the guy's 38, which is not extremely young, but it's kind of young for presidential politics. Usually, by the time somebody's running for president, they've had a fair amount of experience. Sometimes in the business world, like him, or even Burgum is another one who's got a business experience. Trump, of course, but if they have no political experience, then it can be more difficult in terms of certain issues. Foreign policy is one, and even they talked about how he doesn't have a lot of experience, and it hurt him last night, especially when he was going toe-to-toe with Nikki Haley, who does have that foreign policy experience. Now, again, even if you don't necessarily agree with Haley's position and agree with Ramaswamy's, still, she did a better job of defending the position than he did because he doesn't have the experience to back it up. And just in general, you sometimes get folks from the business world that come in and say, hey, we need to have government that's more efficient, more business-like, and so forth. And that's good in terms of wanting to have government that's more efficient. But if you don't know how government works to start with, it's going to be very difficult for you to make changes. And pretty much every person that becomes president finds that out. They make all kinds of promises on the campaign trail, and a lot of that stuff just doesn't happen because especially the federal government is so large that it's extremely difficult to get anything major done unless you have some sort of event that really changes the dynamic. And one example of that with 9/11, that because of the intense nature of that and what happened there, It allowed government to make huge changes, establish the Department of Homeland Security, and as a result, basically a lot of agencies got shifted around in ways that the legislators really couldn't resist because of the situation post 9/11. But back to Ramaswamy, that in terms of sort of that juice that he's got, it certainly appeals to people. It appeals to younger people, and that's not surprising what his kind of audience is. It's sort of how he goes about that, his charisma, his charm, and so forth. But he's got to back it up with more. As I was saying before, the all hat, no cap kind of a thing is he's got to have more substance, more principles to back up what he's saying, partly so that he isn't seemingly reversing himself every couple of months on whatever it is he believes, but also that he's got more information to be able to bring to the table in terms of supporting whatever position he's advocating.
Now, Nikki Haley, I was watching her on stage, and she very much, I felt like, was aiming towards the moderates. And that's some of what I've heard this morning from some of the analysis after the fact is we have some of these candidates up here taking very right-wing approaches to some of the policies that they want to bring forward. But, even when we talked about abortion on stage, Nikki Haley is saying, this is where I stand, but I don't think we should be, arresting women for getting abortions or giving like the death sentence or anything like that. I think she kind of was trying to appeal to far more than just, Republican voters. What do you think that approach was, and do you think it paid off for her?
Yeah, I don't recall her saying, I obviously can't remember everything that the candidates were saying last night, but I don't remember saying anything about women getting arrested for abortions. The person having an abortion, usually the law deals with physicians if they are performing an abortion without the proper procedures and information provided and things of that nature ahead of time. But what she was saying in terms of that practical approach is that you had somebody, I think in one exchange it was Pence, that was saying, hey, 70% of the American electorate wants to have a 15-week limitation on abortions. And Haley's response was saying, 70% of the Senate isn't going to vote for that. Now, her point was, again, a very practical point, is that to get legislation through, although this could change, you still need to have that 60 votes to end the debate. That's what's called cloture. And if you don't have 60 senators out of the 100 that are willing to vote for it, it's not going to happen. And that's what she says, is that right now you have even less than a majority of senators currently in the Senate that controlled by Democrats by a very slim margin, of course, but still, that as long as if you don't even have a majority, you aren't going to get any legislation through that requires 15 weeks, because certainly Democrats aren't going to support it, and even some Republicans won't. And that's the practical aspect. So why run on that particular thing? Well, it's a principled manner. You could say, well, we still want to run on that, even if we aren't going to be able to get it through, because sometimes what happens is that you put legislators on the spot by saying, okay, we're going to pass this or we're going to put it up for a vote, and then you have to go on the record. And that sometimes will cause legislators to change their thinking or change what they're going to do if all of a sudden they have to go on the record for something, or they try to avoid that. So again, it's that political game that a lot of folks don't like. In terms of Haley sort of appealing more to the moderates, toward the independents, of course, and it's the independents, whether it's in Iowa in particular or just nationwide, it's usually the independents that will decide elections, because normally in most states, Democrats and Republicans are sufficiently evenly split. So it's all those people in the middle usually that decide whether a state's going to go one way or another way. And if that's the case, you don't want to take a position that's too extreme. Well, we know that from decades and decades of political science research, is that for the Republicans, you run to the right. For Democrats, you run to the left in the primaries, and then run to the center for the general election. Well, you can't do that quite as much as politicians of old could. That before you had the internet and even cable television and things of that nature, when you back in the days, for those of us old enough to remember, 3 networks, basically, even before Fox came on the scene, that you only got a small bit of news on 3 networks, and then, of course, your newspapers and radio as well. And so it was much more limited. And so it was easier for for candidates to kind of play to their base, whether it was to the right or to the left, and move back into the center for the general election. And you just can't do that quite as much these days. And plus, when you have a situation like this where you have a debate, even though it's the primary and well before even the Iowa caucuses, which are the first contest, a lot of independent voters are looking at this and they're saying, well, who do we want? Who are these people? Especially if they aren't familiar with a lot of the lesser known candidates, whoever they happen to be. And if all of a sudden they're seeing, again, since it's a Republican debate, if they're seeing what they think are very extreme positions, that maybe they'd be happy with 15 weeks, but not so much with 6 weeks. And they see all the candidates saying, yeah, we want to have 6 weeks and we want to make it a national law, national requirement, as opposed to state by state, that it can turn those folks off before you even get to the general election. So that's, I think, partly what Haley was sort of shooting for, is the idea is let's moderate this a little bit. Let's be practical about what's going to appeal to people, because we need to win a general election. And for some of the people on the stage, what Ramaswamy often referred to as the professional politicians, they're basically looking at it in terms of the ultimate goal here for the Republican Party is to win in the general election. And hopefully they can select the person that they believe has the best chance of doing so, whether it's Trump or somebody else.
Now, before I ask about Trump, our last major topic here, I do want to quick ask you your thoughts on this UFO question to Christie. It kind of felt like it came out of left field. Don't get me wrong. I work in social media. I get that this is being talked about, but did it have a place on the debate stage? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, it's one of those odd things for a couple of reasons. One is it's actually been in the news, and we've had congressional hearings on this. And apparently the government has not been telling us everything on this. They've been keeping some of this stuff secret, perhaps for a period of time, or whatever it happens to be, for whatever reason. And I always think of the movie Independence Day is when the president is surprised that, oh, you mean we've had this facility and they've had aliens and all this kind of stuff. But what was also funny about it, and it was that Martha McCallum, who they asked the question and is apparently a resident of New Jersey, is now asking Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, about this. And that's what his basic response was. He's like, I get the UFO question. And then he was teasing Martha, like, well, come on, we're both from New Jersey, but we're not crazy, kind of a thing. And if I'm not mistaken, somebody can check me on this, is that back in the day when Orson Welles had his War of the Worlds radio program with Mercury Theater, that caused a panic in New Jersey. So there was like an additional New Jersey connection there, if I'm remembering it correctly. So it was an amusing kind of a thing, but there were some serious undertones. Whether it really needed to be in the debate, probably not. But I think a little levity at that point was needed.
Well, I mean, he handled it in an amusing way, if anything. Now, let's quick talk about Trump before I let you go. I mean, obviously, he had his interview with Tucker Carlson that premiered on X, formerly known as Twitter. And there were a lot of amusing topics that came up specifically about, his fellow candidates on stage, how he was not going to take the stage because why would he subject himself to 2 hours of harassment? And Tucker Carlson had brought up things like, are we going to have discourse given the outcomes? How do you think this played to Trump's advantage or disadvantage with the American people?
Well, I think there were pros and cons to this, and there were good and bad reasons for Trump to not debate. Now, a lot of people wanted to see Trump debate. Again, we know what Trump's positions are on a variety of issues. He's done all this before, but also having been president for 4 years, this is what he's going to do. Now, things change, and sometimes you want to change your position on things. It's certainly back at the end of Trump's presidency, we were starting to deal with the COVID situation. And so he's been criticized for some of the things that he did at that point, although what we knew at that point was also different, because apparently we weren't being told everything we needed to in terms of, both the virus itself and also in terms of how to deal with it, whether it's masks or the isolation, and people are pushing back on that. And it's in the news again now. And so it's going to be a different situation for Trump to come into should he become president again. And people would like to know that. So that's a reason for him to have wanted, what people wanted him to debate. His perspective is saying, look, I'm leading in the polls by 20, 30, 40 points, just depending on the poll. Why should I debate at this point? Now, that's kind of the attitude that an incumbent might have. And that's what Biden is basically saying, that even though in some polls, RFK Jr. has pulled in the near 20%, and Marianne Williamson has gotten close to 10%. And that's pretty significant for an incumbent president, for two candidates that really wouldn't normally be considered serious. And yet he's certainly not going to debate. He's the incumbent. Why should he? So Trump's kind of taking that position, and that makes a certain amount of sense. It also makes sense that he doesn't debate because there's a certain concern that, given that he doesn't have much of a filter sometimes, especially when he's speaking off the cuff, that he could get himself in additional legal trouble, that Pence could be a witness against him in Trump trials. So I saw some lawyer, an online lawyer. So, I think he does legal stuff, but you can take it for what it's worth. But he was basically saying the potential for being accused of witness intimidation. Well, maybe that's not that much of a stretch, given some of the things that he's already being accused of, or just saying things that would violate one judge's or another requirement to not be talking as much about the trial. And clearly he would, and people would probably bring that up, and he would be limited in what he could reply without getting himself in additional legal trouble. So in that sense, probably not a bad idea for him to have avoided it. Also, and this is kind of the downside though for Trump, is that by not having him on the stage, and even though Trump came up in a couple of the questions, Trump not being on the stage gave everybody else an opportunity to shine that they wouldn't have had. That if Trump had been on the stage, he would have dominated, as he did in debates previously. Things would always come back to him, and he likes to be the center of attention anyway. And he certainly would have been had he been on that stage. And so as a result, he wasn't there. Everybody else got a bit of a chance to either do well for themselves or sometimes not, but at least they had that opportunity. So it's kind of a little back and forth. But it's all probably going to be forgotten because, as we're talking today, Trump's going to go in and be arrested in Georgia for the indictment there. And so we'll be seeing his mugshot, no doubt, later in the day. And this will be the talk for the next several days, and the debate will by and large be forgotten.
Yeah. And I mean, so on that topic, obviously this is another tactic. He could have turned himself in any other day of the week, but he chose the day after the debates. How do you think this is resonating with Iowans? That's kind of what I want to know at this point. I was just at the Iowa State Fair. I was asking people, if you are, supporting Trump, where do you think these indictments land? Do they impact your decision at all? And people, if they're in the Trump camp, they're kind of in the Trump camp. They're not going to leave just because of a couple more indictments. So how do you think this is resonating with Iowans?
One of the things that we saw that came out of the recent Iowa poll was that among Trump supporters, they are really Trump supporters, that they are not considering anybody else. About 2/3, I think, was what the poll showed. About 2/3 of the Trump supporters were not considering anybody else. It was basically Trump or no one. Now, if Trump's doesn't become the nominee, I suppose they probably would pick someone, or maybe even not vote, but they just weren't really considering anybody else. And part of this has to do with the indictments, especially after the first one from New York, that seemed just incredibly political. It seemed really a stretch for that particular district attorney to kind of bootstrap misdemeanors into felonies. And what about the statute of limitations? And so it was all very problematic. And it made the later indictments, the two federal ones, for the concealed weapons and January 6 activities, made them colored in political tones as well. And then, of course, now we get the Georgia one, another state indictment, where you've got 18 people and 41 counts and all this kind of stuff. And so, again, it just reinforces for Trump supporters that it's all political. Now, maybe there is a nugget of seriousness in all of these, especially the ones dealing with the classified documents and the potential cover up for it and all of that. We'll see how that shakes out. Again, a lot of legal experts are all over the place on this. Some saying that it's there's really nothing to it, especially given what happened with other people, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden himself, and so forth. So we'll see how it all shakes out, but it's not really shaking the resolve of the Trump supporters. But there are other groups of people, Iowans included, that are, look, do we really want to have a president that's got all this other stuff going on? And this was one of the difficulties for the candidates on the debate stage, is that basically you need to support Trump in terms of criticizing these as political indictments, but that doesn't necessarily have to translate to supporting Trump for the nomination. And of course, they're running for that nomination. So they've got to try to find a way to say, yeah, I support Trump, that this is all political, but hey, it's in the past, or we still would rather have Trump focusing on his legal problems. He's not going to have time to focus on being the president. So I want to be the president. So you've got to find that distinction, both in terms of the candidates, but even the voters can make that distinction as well, saying, yeah, I think that this is all political. It's a two-tiered system of justice is the way the Republicans are often talking about it. But I still think that we need to move on, or we still need to find somebody else who's going to be able to focus on the problems of the country, not your personal legal problems.
My last question to you is, on stage, they had asked people to raise their hand if they would continue supporting, or if they would support Trump as the nominee if he was convicted of these accusations. And it was so interesting to see. Vivek obviously goes right away. And then there was like this domino effect of slowly other candidates agreeing. Now, that kind of was interesting to me, because I would think that you would have your decision made or not. What did you think came out from that little activity of raising their hands?
The whole raising of hands things is kind of funny. And even the first time they tried to do it, DeSantis kind of objected and said, well, what are we, school children? And it kind of reminded me, and I tried to look this up and couldn't find it, who it was, but there was a debate years ago, I think in the 2008 cycle, it might have been 2012. I can't recall who it was. I think it was Fred Thompson who basically objected to it. It was one of the GOP debates. It was one in Iowa. And basically the Iowa moderator said, raise your hand if you're this. And basically they're saying, wait, we're not doing this kind of thing. I'm raising the hand stuff. And later the moderator was accused of being a school marm kind of a thing. And so I've always kind of thought that these are odd, and they are kind of an odd thing. You can sort of understand that some of these questions should be fairly simple in that regard. In the case of that particular question, this was one of the problems that Ramaswamy had, was that, look, if you're so enthusiastic about supporting Trump, and if you think, as he said later, that Trump is the greatest president we've had in the 21st century, why are you running against him? And so it kind of undercuts and shows that maybe Ramaswamy's not thinking some of this stuff through. But he's got his position, and Ramaswamy has said early on that the first thing he would do would be to pardon Trump, regardless of where the legal challenges or the cases are at that particular point. He would simply pardon Trump and get this off the slate, which actually makes a certain amount of sense, not unlike what Gerald Ford did with Richard Nixon, saying, okay, let's just pardon this. Maybe Nixon did stuff, maybe not, but we need to move on. So that makes a certain amount of sense, even though it'll make a lot of people unhappy. I think the reason that you had sort of a slow roll for the rest of the people to raise their hand had to do with the way the question was asked. Because if I recall correctly, it was, even if Trump is convicted, are you still willing to support him as the presidential nominee? And that adds a different twist to it. It's one thing to be accused, but if you actually get convicted, which is to say, you're going to have a jury that says, yeah, there's enough evidence here. And certainly a lot of people are criticizing the third indictment, the second federal one that's in the District of Columbia, figuring that there's no way that Trump's going to find an unbiased jury in the District of Columbia, which voted some huge margin for Biden rather than Trump. So he's probably going to get convicted there, maybe elsewhere as well. Do you want to have a convicted person be the nominee? And so that's a little different than just being someone's accused that you think the accusations are purely political and won't go anywhere. And that, I think, caused some of the people to slowly raise their hand. And in fact, Asa Hutchinson didn't raise his hand and was questioned about it later, and basically said the same thing I'm suggesting. Say, well, you don't want somebody that's convicted that's going to be the president. So he did sign a pledge to get on the stage to saying that he would support the nominee, but adding that conviction aspect to it is sort of adds a different twist to it.
Well, there was a lot that happened. We have a month out until the next debate. We'll see if Trump decides to join. We'll see who's still around for the next debate and who qualifies. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.